Okay, now that I figured out why the sound wasn't working, this is take 2. Here are my notes that I did yesterday. We'll just redo them with the sound on because it's important that you hear what I say. We're going to be working on percents, decimals, and fractions, and this is just the beginning of our percents unit. So some of this, like I said earlier, is review, and it's important that you understand what you're doing so you can take it to the next level. We're going to start off with a definition, percent, and there are actually 2 definitions for percent. The first is in Latin, so percent comes from Latin, per cento, which means per 100 or for every 100. So cento is the root word, cent meaning 100, per meaning for every. The second definition is a ratio that compares a number to 100. So anything, something out of 100. Can you have percents that are over 100? Yes. Can I have percents that have decimals? Yes. Can I have percents that have fractions? Yes. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a minute. So first, just to review a little bit, if you remember, we talked about decimals and powers of 10 earlier this year. And if I flip through my notebook, I can see decimal places here, 9-4. And I think powers of 10, powers of 10 is over here. So we have discussed decimals before, powers of 10. And I even talked about powers of 10 that are negative, that turn it into smaller numbers, which is dividing. So we're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to use those two. We'll use those 2 things for what we're doing now. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is change a fraction to a decimal to a percent, and vice versa, and all the way around. So we're going to do a percent to a decimal to a fraction to a percent to a decimal, all of those things. Okay, so if I start with a fraction, my goal is to get the denominator to 10, 100, 1,000, any power of 10. If I can't easily get my denominator to a 10, 100, or 1,000, then I must go to the second one, which is divide. Top dog in the house. So here's my example. I'm going to start with 3/8. And I'm first going to change 3/8 into a decimal. And I know that 8 does not easily make 10, 100, or 1,000 when using multiplication or division. Remember, we're pre-algebra now. We look at relationships that are multiplication and division, not adding and subtracting. So I can't easily get my 8 to 10 or 100 or 1,000. So I'm going to go to my second method, which is top dog in the house. Eight does not go into 3. So I put my decimal. And now that my decimal is there, I can put zeros next to my remainder. 8 into 30. 8 into 30 goes 3 times, with 6 left over. Because that decimal's there, I can put another 0 next to my remainder. I can put zeros next to my remainder until I'm done. 8 goes into 67 times, with 4 left over. Because that decimal's there, I can put a 0 next to my remainder. 8 goes into 45 times, and I'm done. So 3/8 is the same as 375 thousandths. All right. Now that I have it into decimal form, I'm going to turn it into a percent. And there's 2 ways to do that. Actually, yeah, I'm gonna give you the next move. So to turn 375 thousandths into a percent, I multiply by 100. And if you remember from multiplying by powers of 10, when we multiply, it makes a number larger. And what that means is it moves the decimal 2 places, because there's 2 zeros in 100, to the right. Multiplying moves the decimal to the right. It makes the number larger. And then all we do is add a percent sign. So 0.375 times 100 moves my decimal to the right twice, which is 37.5%. And I showed you on my notes last night that if I actually do the math, it looks like this, and then I move the decimal in. But because in my head I already know it moves it 2 places to the right, that's why I can do it. So 3/8 is 375 thousandths, which is the same as 37.5 or 37.5%. If I wanted to, I could also write this as an unsimplified fraction, which would be 375 over 1,000, because that's what this says. This ends in the thousandths place. Here's my fraction. I want to get it to 100. I divide by 10. And that would be 37.5 over 100. So they're all the same. All of these things are equivalent. Okay. I'm going to keep going. Sorry, I'm just going to keep going. All right. Can I have a percent that's more than 100? Yes, and here's what it looks like. I got to turn my paper over. Fractions more than 100. Fractions worth more than 100%. Let's put it that way. Okay, so any fraction that has a whole number, so any fraction that is a mixed number, any fraction that is a mixed number is more than 100%. And here's my example. 2 3/5. 3/5 is going to be equivalent to something out of 100. But because I have this whole here, it's more than 100. 2 3/5, if I'm thinking about it as money, I'm going to turn this into a fraction where I can write it in a decimal place. So if I multiply both of these by 2, I get 6/10. So 2 3/5 is the same as 2 6/10. And when I have 2 6/10, I can write it in decimal form. 6/10 goes here. 6/10 is the same as 60/100ths, or 6,000ths. I don't really need these, but I'm showing you that they're all equivalent. The 2 goes before the decimal. It's the whole number. So 2 6/10 is the same as $2.60. Or 6/10 would be 2 6 dimes. Remember our place value. Anything that is before the decimal is the whole. So, any whole before the fraction goes to the left of the decimal because it's a whole. It's a whole. And we made this into tenths to write out the rest of our decimal place. Then, to turn the decimal into a percent, we multiply by 100. So 2.6 times 100 moves my decimal place again 2 places to the right, which gives me 260%, more than 100. And I could even put a 0 here if I wanted to actually have it to move over twice. Okay. To turn a percent into a decimal, do the opposite of multiplying. Divide by 100, or 100 over 1, depending on what it is. It moves the percent sign two places to the left. And let me explain what that means. When we divide by 100, just like multiplying makes it bigger, dividing makes it smaller. And where my percent sign is kind of where my decimal would be, because that's the end of the number, right? So, for example, if I have 260%, I would just go to the left twice to get my decimal, 2.6. I'm going to try it with 43%. 43% is the same as 43 over 100, which is the same as 0.43. All I did was take this percent sign. That's where my decimal would be. I move it 2 to the left, and I get 0.43. I'm going to give you an example of turning a fraction into a percent. So I need a new piece of paper. Okay, turn a fraction into a percent. Again, the fraction or the decimal is just a normal number. To get it into a percent, I need to put per 100. So, multiply by 100, or 100 over 1, because it's a fraction, and simplify. That's the last part that's super important. Multiply by 100 or 100 over 1 and simplify it. So here's my example. We're going to have one that's not so easy. I'm going to take my fraction of 4/7 and I'm going to, actually this is the same exact thing as what we did on the front, but the opposite way. Look, I had a fraction already. I did top dog in the house. And then I multiplied it by 100. So this is the second way to do it. Two ways. Either I multiply it by 100 first, or I multiply it by 100 after. Either way, I'm going to get the same answer. So here in this example, I did top dog in the house first. And then I multiplied it by 100. In our first example. This example, I'm going to multiply it by 100 and then I'm going to divide it. Either way, you get the same answer. So 100 over 1 equals 400 over 7, and then I simplify. 7 into 400. 7 goes into 40 5 times. 5 left over. 7 into 50 goes 7 times, 1 left over. This 1 becomes my numerator, this 7 becomes my denominator, or I could turn it into a decimal, but why do that when I can just make it a fraction and add a percent sign. I can add that percent sign because I already multiplied by 100. 4 over 7 equals 57 and 1/7%. Again, if we compare this to what we did in the beginning, we divided first, then multiplied. Here we multiplied, then simplified. They're the same exact thing. If I wanted to turn this into a decimal, divide by 100, which moves to the left. So 1 2. Well, because I have a fraction, I have to go 3. Because I have this fraction here, this is a piece of it. So it's actually 0.57. I'd have to have this whole thing as a decimal to turn it into a fraction. So, all right, let's turn it into a decimal. 10. 7 into 10 goes 1. 7 into 30 is 4. So this is like 57.14%. And then if I were to move it 2 places to the left, I would get 0.714 as my decimal. So I guess instead of a fraction, sometimes it is important to do a decimal, as long as you know that the decimal will go here and not all the way here, because we have a fraction. Okay. Dividing, multiplying by 100. I just showed you a lot. Okay. Decimal to percent. Here's how I remember it. Multiply percent to decimal, divide. Decimal to percent, multiply, it gets bigger because it's per 100. That means I'm getting it bigger. A percent to a decimal means I'm taking that 100 away and I'm making it smaller. And then depending on if you have a decimal into a fraction, fraction into a decimal, I showed you how to do that. So this is what you're going to be doing today, tonight, on your own. And that we'll talk about when you come in tomorrow. Turn this fraction into a percent and a decimal. And your fraction is 2/9. And it is going to, your decimal will be a repeating decimal, so just round it to the nearest tenth or hundredth. Okay, so do this. And when you come in tomorrow, we'll talk about your answer. All right. That was a lot, but hopefully a lot of it was review as well. Okay.